Fran's given us a bit of input about some of the possible goals of preaching, and in your groups you talked about sermons that you might have heard which were particularly based on teaching or pastoring, encouraging, prophetic for you, transformative, converting. It's not a limited, it's not a complete list. You can think about lots of other effects that sermons might have. And the goal of this really was to get us thinking about the fact that a sermon is not a set thing, but perhaps when you're preparing from the very off, it might be good to think about, well, actually, this strikes me that this sermon is going to be about this, or at least as you are preparing, in the process of preparing, it emerges that this is very clearly a sermon that does this particular thing, and so hone the sermon in that direction. Interesting, in our group, we talked about whether we preach evangelistically for conversion, and perhaps at first we can be a little reticent to do that. But I did encourage our folk to think about how they might invite people to follow Jesus in whatever language, in whatever way seems appropriate into your context and your passage. So, you know, we've underlined this thing about it being focused on Jesus. So how are we inviting people to follow Jesus in what we say? I'm going to press on with the second bit of input tonight, which develops some more ideas around the form of sermons. Now, I don't know if you've got a Bible close to you. Perhaps I should have asked you to go and grab one, or whether you dig up on your phone now, that's the way you do it. But we are going to look at a Bible passage to illustrate what we do tonight. We're going to look at Luke, or put up on your screen. You may be clever enough to put it on your screen. Luke chapter 7 and verses 11 to 17. Luke 7, 11 to 17. It's the story of Jesus. It's known as the widow at Nain. So we're going to use that. So it's probably quite handy to have that in front of you in some way as we go through this next part. I'm going to also screen share at this point because I want to illustrate some of the things that we're doing. So I'm going to screen share. Yeah, so does that look about right to you, folks? Great. Okay, Margaret's nodding. If Margaret's nodding, I'm happy. So yeah. So last week we talked about preaching, you might remember, as an event. It's a Tom Wright's word. Preaching as an event, as a kind of doorway. There's another idea. So we take people from one place and they move into another place. But I have another analogy for you, and this is probably one you're familiar with, is the idea of preaching as a bridge. And so as a preacher, you are building a bridge. So here you go. Here's my bridge for you. Oh, by the way, I'm really rubbish with technology. So I've just seen it says at the bottom, add text here in Open Sans. Sorry, that's one bit that didn't get edited out. Apologies. Classic evangelical approaches to preaching is to read the text, to start in the text, to explain what it says, and then apply it to contemporary life, in which case you are building a bridge from the Bible, there on the left-hand side, over and into contemporary life. Classic way evangelicals preach. But I want to suggest that there's also an alternative, in which case you might wish to start in the contemporary world with contemporary life, and then build a bridge over to the Bible. Let me just explain how that happens. So you're used to, I guess, quoting the text, explain the text, and then saying, so today this means for us, or a modern expression of this might be, what Jesus is calling us to do today is this. We're doing the Bible into contemporary life. The other way, I would suggest, is starting with illustrations or situations or problems within modern life, to explain those, to delve into those, to express something of the complexity of these things. And then you build a bridge by saying, the Bible has something to say about this. The Bible has wisdom and truth and light on this matter. And what I want to spend time with you now is to express and share with you something of what God says in his word, or something which Jesus did, which makes sense of this contemporary problem or situation that we are facing. So just want to open up to the idea that you can kind of go either way across this bridge. Most naturally, probably Bible, contemporary life, but you could also do it the other way down, and perhaps you yourselves are doing that already. Now, the passage that I want us to look at is this one, the widow at Nain. And what I'm going to attempt to do is give you various models of how you might preach on this one passage in a variety of different ways. Probably best for me to read it through to you. It is one of my favorite Bible stories. I think it's a neglected one. It's not so spectacular, but there's a killer phrase in it, which I absolutely love. So let me read this out to you. You can follow it. I'm reading, by the way, from the New Revised Standard Version.
Oh, sorry, Ashley, could you remind me of the chapter again?
Of course, it's Luke chapter 7.
Thank you.
And verses 11 to 17. So it says this. Soon after, he, Jesus, went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he was moved with compassion for her and said, "Do not cry." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stopped. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people." This word about him spread throughout the whole of Judea and all the surrounding region. So, simple story, you probably know it well already. But I want to look at this passage and illustrate how you might preach in different forms from this one text. Now, the first way is probably the most classic, obvious way, to look at it exegetically. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this word, but exegesis is just simply about explaining and understanding. So it's to look at this passage and simply explain and understand, explain to understand something about what this passage contains for us. So in its pure form, exegetical preaching is about explaining the meaning of the text. However, we will all at some point, because I've done it, if you've not done it, well done, but we all do it. If exegesis is looking at the text and taking meaning out of the text, all of us, well, I have at times, is to do the reverse, which is not a very good thing, which is to take our existing meaning and impose it on the text, project it on the text. So, for example, if I was preaching about love and I saw the word love in the text, but rather than delve into that word love as it sits in the text, the kind of love that this passage is talking about, and I just talked about love in general terms, that kind of love, I'm basically just simply taking my existing understanding and imposing it on the text. And my encouragement to you would be that in my experience, the power of your preaching rests significantly on staying very tight to the text and its meaning. That's where the power exists. So if it's about love, or C.S. Lewis told us there were 4 loves, didn't he, in Greek? If it's about love, which of those loves? What's the context of that love? Not just generally about, I love my wife, I love my cat, I love playing football. No, what's the love here? So staying tight to that. So exegesis of meaning is really very important. Last week in our group, we referenced commentaries. We'll talk about those in future weeks, but understanding the text is really crucial. It helps you remain tight to the text. There are, in that story of the widow at Nain, a number of different meanings, explanations that you might be able to give. And I'm just going to illustrate, whoops, I've gone, let's go back one. Here's a number of the different ways in which we might exegetically explain or preach that passage. So we might talk about the fact that Jesus is moved with compassion. It's there in verse 13. This is, God is not an impassive God. He's not a distant, disinterested God. We read here that Jesus is moved with compassion. So there's a great preaching point. That's an exegetical preaching point. There it is in the text, Jesus moved with compassion. Equally, whether you just stick on that or you have 2 points or 3 points, here's another one. Jesus has the power to heal. So we do not follow an impotent God, but we follow a God who is powerful, who is able, who gets involved in the practical reality of life. Or thirdly, I mean, you probably come up with lots already from this passage, Jesus desires to restore people. So I've said it's got this killer line for me, which always kind of half chokes me up. But when I read in the passage in verse 15, the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Wow. Wow. Jesus gave this boy back to his mum. Can you imagine how she felt? Here is a God who desires to restore relationships, which is a wonderful thing. So, you know, this is very basic stuff, but I just want to give you illustrations. So this is exegetical preaching, looking at the text, what's going on, and bringing out from it various points that we might want to talk about. So moving on, another way we could preach is to preach thematically with a theme, which might involve more than one text. So you might preach passages. Sorry, I'll just go back a second. I'll come on to that in a second. You might preach on a series on relationships, on the theme of marriage or on family. You might want to talk about war. What's the Christian approach to war from the Bible? Justice, honesty, faithfulness. You might want to talk about prayer throughout the Bible or hospitality. So there's all the great kind of themes that we can talk about in Scripture. And the strength of this kind of preaching is clearly that you get to use a whole lot of the Bible, a lot more than just one simple passage, which will clearly enrich and give different angles or different facets to the subject you're looking at. The danger, I guess, of preaching thematically is that in preaching and referencing all these different passages, you might be a bit boring because all you're doing is quoting, well, it says about compassion here and about compassion there and about compassion there. Okay, you just give me a list of verses about compassion, Ash. So that's a danger. And also the danger is that you just skim over the surface. My natural inclination is to have a short passage and to delve deep into it. And sometimes it can feel a little bit unsatisfying. You just get a little taster of a whole lot of stuff. But equally, it has its worth. You can enrich a subject by using different angles. So the slide I was going to show you, the thematic one, we realize that in this Luke 7 passage, we find the subject of compassion. And it's, I think, compassion for the mum, for the widow in this story. We read that when Jesus saw her, he had compassion for her. That's probably the motivation for this healing. It seems a strange thing. Was he motivated most to heal the boy, or was he mostly motivated because he had compassion for the woman? But to develop that, you could reference other stories about compassion. So I've just put up some there. You've got the rich young man, obviously, Jesus looked at him and loved him. The woman caught in adultery, Jesus says, neither do I condemn you. Compassion for the family of Lazarus, when Jesus found out that his friend had died, that Jesus wept, shortest verse in the Bible. And the multiple verses you find where it says the Lord is gracious and compassionate. So I'm preaching on Luke 7. You may want to just pick out that theme and then link it to other examples of that theme, whether it's compassion or the God who is powerful to heal, or the God who restores people back in relationship. So we've had a simply exegetical approach just on the passage. And here we looked at themes, where we pick out a theme and might develop that theme by bringing in other passages as well. Okay with that so far? Because this is the simple end. I'm going to get it a little bit more interesting as we move on. I want to talk to you about a form of preaching that emerged probably about 40 odd years ago. It sounds a long time ago, but probably relatively recent in preaching terms. You may have heard of the idea of narrative preaching, which in my understanding is something of a coverall term for a number of different ways to preach. But the common factor of all narrative sermons is that they have about them the form of a story. So they have the form of a story. Bit of history for you. The person in history who's kind of fated as being the one who first analysed the understanding of stories was Aristotle. And we have to go back 2,400 years to kind of get to the time of Aristotle. And he made lots of observations about stories, which we don't have time to go into. But what concerns us here is that he looked at the structure of a story. So if you remember, Fran last week said that sermons have a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's Aristotle. That's exactly what he was citing almost 2,500 years ago. So here on the screen, let me just show you this. Here's a very basic structure, very Aristotelian structure for a story / a sermon. You have an opening scene. You have a problem. And sometimes the best stories are those which really bring us in and get us intrigued because the problem gets even worse. And then ultimately you must have the place where everything turns around, the turning point, the decisive action that saves the day, rescues the whatever. And then you have what's called the denouement, which is basically just how things then play out, and you're left with the final scene. So I think it's pretty straightforward. An opening scene, the problem gets worse, but then the decisive action, the denouement, and the final scene. If you think of basically any Disney film, that's what they do. Whether it's Snow White, Toy Story, Saving Nemo, it's Aristotelian classic storytelling stuff. There's Woody thinking he's a wonderful toy, but no, the problem is that he's got a rival called Buzz Lightyear, and the problem gets worse because Woody's family's moving, blah, 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 blah. It's classic storytelling stuff. So how would we fit the story of the widow at Nain into this particular narrative structure? Well, I've done it for you, I think. Apologies for the small text, but I think you can quite easily divide up those 7 verses in this way. So the opening scene, of course, is we are painted a picture by Luke of Jesus going to a town with his disciples and loud crowds with him. Okay, great. But then we're confronted with a problem. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. There's a problem. There's been a death. And in fact, that problem gets worse because we find out that the boy who's died no longer has 2 parents. but he's only got a mum, because she's walked this path before when she buried her husband, and now she's doing it again with her son. It's a double problem. The problem's become worse. The whole decisive action is when Jesus kind of takes charge. He's moved with compassion. He instructs them, don't cry, and then he acts. He touches the bier. The bearers stop. Jesus speaks these powerful words, and the dead man rises up. And this wonderful phrase, Jesus gives him back to his mother. The denouement, how things play out. Well, we read that fear seized all of them as they glorified God, saying, great prophet has come amongst us. And the final scene, which kind of mirrors the beginning, where they were going into the town, that word about him spread throughout the whole of Judea and all the surrounding region. So we've just set this passage in a different way. We've done your exegesis, taking points out. We've done our thematic, landing on a particular aspect of the passage. And here's another model, a narrative model of how we might choose to preach. Just two more things to make us stretch us even more tonight. How we might deliver this sermon in a narrative style could take different forms. And one form I'm going to suggest to you is telling the story as if you were really there. Okay, don't know if you've ever dared to do this before. You might have heard sermons done this way. But imagine you becoming one of the characters, either named or unnamed. So imagine you were an onlooker, just a resident of Nain. Or perhaps you're one of the unnamed disciples, or perhaps one of the named characters, or someone who was a observer of this, who is recounting the story later in the day to somebody who wasn't there. This kind of preaching, taking the first person, works best with stories, clearly. So the gospel stories or the Old Testament narratives work really well. You might wonder, where on earth do I begin with this? To which the answer is actually very straightforward. You do all your normal preparation for a sermon, just as you would for any other one, if you wanted to preach in the first person. So you study the passage, you get to know what it's all about, you land on the kind of key points, what's the thing that's really grabbed you, what you want to say. So you've done all that preparation. And then, once you've done that, start writing it out in the first person. And as you do, you begin to weave in all those points, all that work you've done, that point. So, for example, the compassion thing, we landed on the fact that Jesus had compassion for the woman. When you get to that point of the story, this is where you go to town on compassion. You talk about the impact it had on this widow, that Jesus took notice of her. You talked about what you saw in Jesus's eyes. There is liberty here to kind of go beyond the text clearly in what you say, but you land on that. So you do your normal preparation, but weave in to what you say all those points that you have prepared. One other suggestion for you, I found this most helpfully done, where in your speaking, you appeal to the five senses. In other words, you talk about what it looks like. The sky was blue. It was a hot day. You talk about what it smelt like, what you were hearing, how perhaps the rough cart bearing the body felt like, etc. And by talking about things that you can see, hear, smell, touch, and whatever the other one is, taste, you really draw the listener into what you're saying. So appealing to those senses. So, okay, what does this actually look like? I'm obviously not going to give you a whole sermon in that kind of first person style, but here's an intro for you. This is what I wrote earlier this week. It was a clear, bright morning, and the mist was beginning to disperse as the sun rose higher. A bright day for a funeral. I'd known the family all my life, mum, dad, and their son. Yes, their son. What a tragedy. It's one thing to lose your husband, but your boy, everyone in Nain had been touched by his death. That, I hope, gives you a little idea of the way in which you might preach this in a kind of narrative style. And it's a lot of fun, by the way. I'd encourage you to give it a go. There is one very useful book, we'll send out the notes, but Roger Standing wrote a book called Finding the Plot, which is all about preaching in this particular style, and may be very useful if that was interest to you. The other way I want to talk to you about narrative is a particular version of that classic storytelling form. It was devised by an American called Eugene Lowry, who said that a sermon should be like a story, should be like a good film, and have a great plot with 5 stages. So here we go. I'm going to hit you with what has become known as the Lowry loop, which, if you see, starts in the top left-hand corner, goes down around and finishes in the top right-hand corner. So in the Lowry loop, what you're trying to do is cover these 5 bases. This is your template, your form. You've got your oops, the thing that upsets the equilibrium, the problem, if you like. It could be a problem in life, a problem in faith, even perhaps a problem where we thought the Bible said this, but perhaps actually it says that. So there's a oops, something's been upset. And that's how you start. Then you move on to talking about the This is where you delve deeper into that problem. Where's this all going? I thought the Bible was very clear about this, but there's another verse that gives a different perspective on this. This is looking a bit more tricky. Then you have that aha, clue to resolution. Now, if you remember that previous form, this will be like your transforming moment. Often, this might be the point where you bring in gospel truth, or you might bring in Jesus said, etc., or an action that Jesus does. That's the transforming bit. Gives us a hint that something might change here, which moves on to the bit where we experience the gospel. This is the bit that's going to excite us, the we bit, the exciting bit. And at this point, we understand the Bible is giving us some hope, some light, something new is coming to bear at this point. And then finally, the sermon lands on the final consequences, the denouement, the working out. So if we were to live this way, if we follow Jesus in this action, life will look like this for us. There will be forgiveness, there will be hope, there will be justice because of these things. So we've gone through there very, very briefly what's called the Lowry loop, which I hope you can see is a kind of narrative preaching in the way that it is presented. So just in brief summary, I'm going to stop sharing at this point. Let me just, I keep giving you the next slide by mistake. So we looked at preaching as a bridge. We talked about it going either way, Bible, contemporary life, Bible. Looked at some different forms. So the classic one we probably all know and are used to is the exegetical approach, just taking points and meaning out of the Bible. Also look at thematic, though. You may be familiar with that as well and have done that yourselves, where there may be a theme in a passage which you might bring other verses and other stories to bear on that. That can bring richness. It also could kind of water things down. So just to be careful how we use thematic. And then this idea of narrative preaching, which quite simply follows stories like, I haven't taught you anything new about stories. You use stories like that anyway. They start, there's a situation, a problem needs to be resolved. There's the decisive action that changes it, and then you have the outworking of that. So this is your challenge in your group, and I've overrun time. I apologize for this, but I'm going to put up on the chat the 5 steps of the Lowry loop. Your oops, are, we, yeah, with a brief explanation. And what I'm inviting you to do in your groups is to look at your Luke 7 passage and to work out how you might preach on Luke 7, 11 to 17, using that Lowry loop